Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick Wallace. An account of a storm of thunder and lightning near Ludgate in Cornwall, in a letter from the Reverend Mr. William Borlase, M.A. F.R.S., to the Reverend Dr. Littleton, Dean of Exeter. Extract from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, 1753. Read February 15th, 1753. Ludgate, February 1st, 1753. Reverend Sir, since you have received only a short and general account of the lightning in my neighbourhood on the 20th of December last, I send you the notes which I took on the spot, in which you will excuse me although I should be too minutely circumstantial for fear I should omit anything which might contribute ever so little to give you at this distance a just idea of what happened. About 8 that morning I perceived the sky all of a sudden overcast in the east with very dark and red angry clouds, and during the continuance of the clouds the wind very boisterous. These clouds passed away, and at intervals we had clear blue sky, and then large clouds again attended with cold showers. About 12:15 there was neither rain nor wind, but sunshine. However, some flying thin clouds were at this time observed to join and form a body in the northwest, and then ensued one of the most shocking peals of thunder I ever heard, attended here at Ludgate with much lightning, but it did no harm. It was so also in the high grounds of St. Hilary, next parish to this on the east, where a gentleman travelling found all the downs round him on a sudden full of lightning, but was rather frighted than hurt. But this thundercloud broke about 3 miles to the west of this place, in the side of Moylfra Hill, in the parish of Madden, where the marks of it, when I traced them, were as in the following sketches. The first traces were an incision or scratch made in the turf about 3 inches wide and 2 deep, where the lightning coming up from the southwest at A, passing through the bank B, and issuing out of the bank in 3 streams, which united again at C, turned away to the north at D. About 10 paces to the north of these breaches there are more marks of the same kind, but not in the same direction. For the lightning here came from the northwest, and passing upwards I observed the furrow which it had made to grow wider and somewhat deeper as it gained upon the hill, especially where it met with bank or stone. And some banks were 5 feet wide, which had their tops untouched, but were pierced through as with a bullet. This second furrow was, as all the rest, not in a straight line, but in a vermicular direction, and with its turnings led us to a cairn or ledge of flat rocks, E. Here the lightning, passing parallel to the side of the cairn, HL, came in a direction from west by north, and meeting with a flat rock, FI, which in our country we call a quoit, standing on its edge, that southern part of which, I, directly opposed its passage, cut off all that end of this quoit at the dotted lines, split the quoit into 2 thinner ones, took off several splinters, and left large spots of sulphur, whitish like arsenic, on that side whence the slivers were taken off. On the top of this quoit there is a remarkable incision, about 3 inches long and as many wide, from which a piece of that quoit of the same dimensions was carried off, and in the same manner as if a musket ball had been fired at it. The lightning from this rock spread itself to the south in 2 branches, G and M, breaking and rooting up some stones, and making its way clear under others, and appearing again on the other side. These last mentioned furrows were 10 inches wide and a foot deep, besides which we found several places in the hill which had holes about a foot wide and 6 or 8 inches deep, and several clods cut thin and clear off from ground, which shows that as this lightning went like darts through banks and stones, and tore up the ground in many places like a ploughshare, so in other places it spread into an horizontal thin edge, which scooped up and carried off the little unevennesses of the turfy ground. The whole workings of this lightning were in length about a furlong from west to east. There were several people not far from the hill at this time, whose names I will not trouble you with. 2 women, one half a mile, the other but a quarter of a mile distant, saw a smoke at the cairn above mentioned, as if several muskets had been discharged there. A 3rd woman, not a furlong distant from the cairn, saw the town place where her house was, as it were, all on fire. And during this dreadful thunder the sheep on the hill ran to and fro, as if driven by a pack of dogs. This hill of Moelvre is the highest land between North and South Sea in this part, about 2 miles from the former and 4 from the latter. The wind was at west and west-northwest. The first thunderclap was succeeded in less than a quarter of an hour by another, which broke at a village in the parish of Gulval called Trevor, about 1.5 miles to the southwest of Moelvre Hill, and was attended with the following melancholy accidents, which, that you may the better apprehend, I have added a plan of the house showing the different stations of the persons who suffered. Thomas Olivet, a farmer of good substance and repute, was returned from the field about a quarter before 12 o'clock, and had all his family round him in the kitchen, except his daughter, who was in the hall. There was a pan over the fire in the kitchen chimney, full of boiling water. The farmer was sitting by the fire at 1, and his wife on a bench before it at 2. Their only son, 23 years of age, was standing at the window, 8, when it lightened much, and the first clap of thunder, spoken of before, followed. This clap of thunder was so violent here that nothing was remembered equal to it, and the back door of the kitchen, 6, which opened to the north, quivered. The farmer called to his son and desired him not to stand so near the window, lest the lightning should hurt his eyes, upon which the young man removed from the window backwards into the corner of the room and sat down at 3. For this the apprentice boy, laughing at him, was chid by his master, and luckily for him sent out of the room to take care of something without doors. The lightning came from the west-northwest, and falling upon the stack of the kitchen chimney, which was about 4 feet square and as much in height, of hewed stone, carried it clear off from the house and threw it into a pool of water 20 feet distant. In the chamber over the kitchen, directly beneath the top of the chimney, there was a little closet boarded in. All the boards were broken to pieces, the timbers of the roof shattered, also the bedstead in that chamber. Of the chamber partition 2 planks were forced, a large clothes-press thrown, and the south windows of the chamber floor, excepting one casement, all broken and blown out. From the top of the chimney and chamber floor it descended into the kitchen below, where the family was. The farmer saw no lightning, nor heard any thunder, after the first clap before mentioned, but as soon as he had given the orders to his apprentice boy as before said, was struck senseless with the first flash, and thrown into the middle of the kitchen, and continued senseless for a quarter of an hour. As soon as he came to himself, he asked who struck him, but had not the use of his arms, and felt an aching pain, shooting, as he described it, into his bones. And a brand iron, which hung in the chimney, being thrown down into the pan of water, had dashed the boiling water upon him to that degree that his life was in extreme danger for more than a fortnight after. Mrs. Olivet, sitting at 2, was struck down before the hearth, 13. Both her shoes, though buckled on as usual, were struck off her feet, but her feet not hurt, and being neither burnt nor senseless, was able to cry out for help, but could not move, for she had no use of her underlimbs for a day and a half. The farmer's brother was at the end of a long table, at 4, in the same room, and was only flung against the wall about 3 feet distant, not hurt. Mrs. Olivet's sister was near the back door, at 6. A plank of this door was started and beat in. She was struck senseless and thrown 12 feet off against the settle, 12, which stood against the south wall of the house. The farmer's son was sitting at 3. His coat and waistcoats, for he had 2 on, were torn into shreds, so that I could hardly distinguish where the pieces had formerly joined. His shirt had a rent 2 feet long down the back and was scorched, his left shoe torn from his foot, and the little toe of that foot so near cut off that it hung but by a bit of skin, and he was quite dead. But though reduced to this lamentable condition as to his exterior, he was not moved from his seat, nor his face at all changed. His dog was lying at his feet, dead likewise, but never moved. The farmer's daughter received the shock in the hall at 7, was struck senseless, but revived soon, fell to trembling all over, her feet tickling and partly benumbed and stiff as if sleeping. But perceiving in the room a cloud of smoke, and hearing her mother cry, she made haste into the kitchen, which she found full of smoke, stinking like brimstone. The lightning had left a mark quite across the clavel of the kitchen chimney, about half an inch wide, in an undulating direction, broke through the partitions of the underfloor, thrown down the shelves, carried out all the south windows, forced up the staircase, blown out the north window, 10, missed or spared a clock, which stood close by the window, at 11, and being somewhat spent when it reached the hall, 7, carried out the windows, moved not some delft basins which were in the south window, but forced the door of a buffet, 14, at the end of the hall 1.5 inches inwards, and shook the eastern wall of the house to the very foundation. I proposed only to lay before you the matter of fact in the order of time, place, and degree as it happened, but I cannot help admiring the different motions, shapes, and effects of this lightning. The clouds over Moelvre Hill and the village of Trethel, a space of 1.5 miles, were so heavily charged with lightning that here they broke both the first and the second time, and the thunderclaps were within a few minutes of one another, as being produced but by 2 portions of one and the same congeries. The general tendency of this lightning was as the direction of the wind at that time, that is, from the northwest to the east. But where the principal explosions were, as at the hill and the house, many branches spread off in all directions. Nor were the shapes in which it operated less different than its motions. Sometimes, as it appeared to me at Ludgate, it was pointed as a dart, in some places edged as a scythe, now but one thin sheet or stream, then 2 or 3, and then one again. Now it fell as several separate balls of fire, but upon the house as a large gush or torrent. It was all fire, yet of different powers, according to the impregnation of its several portions. Subtle and penetrating as the electrical fire, it affected, shocked, and permeated all the human frame. Some parts of it only scorched wood, but did not melt iron, as with lightning is very common. Some tore the leather and clothes, some cut and wounded, and some killed without wound or rent. And other parts of this lightning, again, upon stone, wood, leather, clothes, and flesh, only rushed and forced with the power of air put into a violent agitation. All this happened in this place, and all in an instant. And although the clothes were somewhat singed as well as torn, and the young man's skin round his waist was also scorched, yet from the general effects of this lightning in both places, I conclude that it was rather swift and irresistibly piercing than inflammatory. The house stands very high, without tree or hill near it. I went thither purposely to examine into the circumstances of this melancholy accident, and after I had talked a little with the farmer and his family, and they had all, for my satisfaction, kindly entered into a detail of the particulars, the tears appeared in the eyes of some. Others, even then, though almost a month after the misfortune, trembled, and all faltered in their speech, and could not go on with their story without frequent pauses. I remain, sir, your most obedient servant, William Borlase, Ludgate, February 2nd, 1753. End of An Account of a Storm of Thunder and Lightning near Ludgate in Cornwall.
Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Aurora Borealis in 1719. From Historic Storms of New England, by Sidney Purley. The Northern Lights, as they are called, first attracted the attention of the people of New England in March 1718, and there was a general fear that dire calamities would result therefrom. May 5th, 1719. The most beautiful and brilliant Aurora Borealis was first observed here as far as any record or tradition of that period informs us, and it is said that in New England it was first noticed only 3 years before this date. In December of the same year the aurora again appeared, and the people became greatly alarmed, not dreading it so much as a means of destruction, but as a precursor of the fires of the last great day and a sign of coming dangers. Just before 8 o'clock in the evening of Saturday the 11th of the month, Lewis, in his History of Lynn, Massachusetts, says that it occurred on the 17th. The moon being within 1 or 2 days of the full, the aurora flamed up in the northern heavens with remarkable brilliancy, until that entire section of the firmament seemed to be on fire. Stephen Jocks, of Newbury, Massachusetts, wrote in his journal at the time that a white rainbow appeared in the northern sky, reaching from the northwest to the northeast, and nearly straight in the middle, the curve being imperfect. It was apparently about 8 feet wide, Jocks continues, and resembled a cloud. Then there appeared in the north very red clouds, which seemed to fly up almost to the zenith, as if driven by a swift ring. They then parted towards the east and vanished. The bow remained an hour or 2. The people distinctly hearing the coruscation, which in the language of the writer of that time rustled like a silken banner. Later in the same evening, between 10 and 11 o'clock, from the northwest came a cloud resembling a mist, through which the stars could be seen, its color being deep crimson. The next day other luminous appearances in the evening sky occurred. Though at first the people were fearful of the consequences of such sights, the feeling wore off as they became more frequent, and it was found that they were without any apparent effect upon the world. They have now become sights of curiosity merely to most people, who, while they cannot fully explain them, know that they portend no evil, though many have ever since those early times been more or less concerned when any strange cloud appears. Dr. Edward A. Hollyhock of Salem, Massachusetts, wrote the following in his diary under the date of December 29th, 1736. The first aurora borealis I ever saw. The northern sky appeared suffused with a dark blood red colored vapor, without any variety of different colored rays. I have never seen the like. The appearance of which he wrote was that which was supposed to have reference to the terrible throat distemper which carried off so many hundreds of children throughout New England at that period. Just before our war with Mexico occurred, the red aurora appeared in its deepest color, and many that looked upon it still believe that it was a forerunner of the bloody conflict. End of The Aurora Borealis in 1719.
Coffee Break Collection 13. Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bad Weather by Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. Big raindrops were pattering on the dark windows. It was one of those disgusting summer holiday rains which, when they have begun, last a long time, for weeks, till the frozen holiday-maker grows used to it and sinks into complete apathy. It was cold. There was a feeling of raw, unpleasant dampness. The mother-in-law of a lawyer called Kvashin and his wife, Nadyezhda Filipovna, dressed in waterproofs and shawls, were sitting over the dinner-table in the dining-room. It was written on the countenance of the elder lady that she was, thank God, well fed, well clothed, and in good health, that she had married her only daughter to a good man, and now could play her game of patience with an easy conscience. Her daughter, a rather short, plump, fair young woman of 20, with a gentle, anemic face, was reading a book with her elbows on the table. Judging from her eyes, she was not so much reading as thinking her own thoughts, which were not in the book. Neither of them spoke. There was the sound of pattering rain, and from the kitchen they could hear the prolonged yawns of the cook. Kvashin himself was not at home. On rainy days he did not come to the summer villa, but stayed in town. Damp, rainy weather affected his bronchitis, and prevented him from working. He was of the opinion that the sight of the grey sky and the tears of rain on the windows deprived one of energy and induced the spleen. In the town, where there was greater comfort, bad weather was scarcely noticed. After 2 games of patience, the old lady shuffled the cards and took a glance at her daughter. "I have been trying with the cards whether it will be fine to-morrow, and whether our Alexei Stepanovitch will come," she said. "It is 5 days since he was here. The weather is a chastisement from God." Nadyezhda Philipovna looked indifferently at her mother, got up, and began walking up and down the room. "The barometer was rising yesterday," she said doubtfully, "but they say it is falling again to-day." The old lady laid out the cards in 3 long rows and shook her head. "Do you miss him?" she asked, glancing at her daughter. "Of course." "I see you do. I should think so. He hasn't been here for 5 days. In May the utmost was 2, or at most 3 days. And now it is serious, 5 days. I am not his wife, and yet I miss him. And yesterday, when I heard the barometer was rising, I ordered them to kill a chicken and prepare a carp for Alexei Stepanovitch. He likes them. Your poor father couldn't bear fish, but he likes it. He always eats it with relish." "My heart aches for him," said the daughter. "We are dull, but it is duller still for him, you know, mamma." "I should think so. In the law courts day in and day out, and in the empty flat at night alone, like an owl." "And what is so awful, mamma, he is alone there without servants. There is no one to set the samovar or bring him water. Why didn't he engage a valet for the summer months? And what is the use of the summer villa at all, if he does not care for it? I told him there was no need to have it. But no. 'It is for the sake of your health,' he said. And what is wrong with my health? It makes me ill that he should have to put up with so much on my account." Looking over her mother's shoulder, the daughter noticed a mistake in the patience, bent down to the table and began correcting it. A silence followed. Both looked at the cards and imagined how their Alexei Stepanovitch, utterly forlorn, was sitting now in the town in his gloomy, empty study, and working, hungry, exhausted, yearning for his family. "Do you know what, mamma?" said Nadyezhda Philipovna suddenly, and her eyes began to shine. "If the weather is the same to-morrow, I'll go by the first train and see him in town. Anyway, I shall find out how he is, have a look at him, and pour out his tea." And both of them began to wonder how it was that this idea, so simple and easy to carry out, had not occurred to them before. It was only half an hour in the train to the town, and then 20 minutes in a cab. They said a little more, and went off to bed in the same room, feeling more contented. "Oh, ho, ho! Lord, forgive us sinners!" sighed the old lady when the clock in the hall struck 2. "There is no sleeping." "You are not asleep, mamma?" the daughter asked in a whisper. "I keep thinking of Alyosha. I only hope he won't ruin his health in town. Goodness knows where he dines and lunches, in restaurants and taverns." "I have thought of that myself," sighed the old lady. "The Heavenly Mother save and preserve him. But the rain, the rain!" In the morning the rain was not pattering on the panes, but the sky was still gray. The trees stood looking mournful, and at every gust of wind they scattered drops. The footprints on the muddy path, the ditches and the ruts were full of water. Nadezhda Philipovna made up her mind to go. "Give him my love," said the old lady, wrapping her daughter up. "Tell him not to think too much about his cases, and he must rest. Let him wrap his throat up when he goes out. The weather, God help us! And take him the chicken. Food from home, even if cold, is better than at a restaurant." The daughter went away, saying that she would come back by an evening train or else next morning. But she came back long before dinner time, when the old lady was sitting on her trunk in her bedroom and drowsily thinking what to cook for her son-in-law's supper. Going into the room, her daughter, pale and agitated, sank on the bed without uttering a word or taking off her hat, and pressed her head into the pillow. "But what is the matter?" said the old lady in surprise. "Why back so soon? Where is Alexei Stepanovitch?" Nadezhda Philipovna raised her head and gazed at her mother with dry, imploring eyes. "He is deceiving us, mamma," she said. "What are you saying? Christ be with you!" cried the old lady in alarm, and her cap slipped off her head. "Who is going to deceive us? Lord, have mercy on us!" "He is deceiving us, mamma," repeated her daughter, and her chin began to quiver. "How do you know?" cried the old lady, turning pale. "Our flat is locked up. The porter tells me that Alyosha has not been home once for these 5 days. He is not living at home. He is not at home. Not at home." She waved her hands and burst into loud weeping, uttering nothing but, "Not at home. Not at home." She began to be hysterical. "What's the meaning of it?" muttered the old woman in horror. "Why, he wrote the day before yesterday that he never leaves the flat. Where is he sleeping? Holy saints!" Nadezhda Philipovna felt so faint that she could not take off her hat. She looked about her blankly, as though she had been drugged, and convulsively clutched at her mother's arms. "What a person to trust! A porter!" said the old lady, fussing round her daughter and crying. "What a jealous girl you are! He is not going to deceive you, and how dare he? We are not just anybody. Though we are of the merchant class, yet he has no right, for you are his lawful wife. We can take proceedings. I gave 20,000 roubles with you. You did not want for a dowry." And the old lady herself sobbed and gesticulated, and she felt faint too, and lay down on her trunk. Neither of them noticed that patches of blue had made their appearance in the sky, that the clouds were more transparent, that the first sunbeam was cautiously gliding over the wet grass in the garden, that with renewed gaiety the sparrows were hopping about the puddles, which reflected the racing clouds. Towards evening Kvashin arrived. Before leaving town he had gone to his flat, and had learned from the porter that his wife had come in his absence. "Here I am," he said gayly, coming into his mother-in-law's room, and pretending not to notice their stern and tear-stained faces. "Here I am. It's 5 days since we have seen each other." He rapidly kissed his wife's hand and his mother-in-law's, and with the air of a man delighted at having finished a difficult task, he lolled in his armchair. "Oh!" he said, puffing out all the air from his lungs. "Here I have been worried to death. I have scarcely sat down. For almost 5 days now I have been, as it were, bivouacking. I haven't been to the flat once, would you believe it? I have been busy the whole time with the meeting of Shipunov's and Ivanchikov's creditors. I had to work with Galdeyev's office at the shop. I've had nothing to eat or to drink, and slept on a bench. I was chilled through. I hadn't a free minute. I hadn't even time to go to the flat. That's how I came not to be at home, Nadyusha." And Kvashin, holding his sides as though his back were aching, glanced stealthily at his wife and mother-in-law to see the effect of his lie, or, as he called it, diplomacy. The mother-in-law and wife were looking at each other in joyful astonishment, as though beyond all hope and expectation they had found something precious which they had lost. Their faces beamed, their eyes glowed. "My dear man," cried the old lady, jumping up, "why am I sitting here? Tea, tea at once. Perhaps you are hungry." "Of course he is hungry," cried his wife, pulling off her head a bandage soaked in vinegar. "Mamma, bring the wine and the savouries. Natalia, lay the table. Oh, my goodness, nothing is ready." And both of them, frightened, happy, and bustling, ran about the room. The old lady could not look without laughing at her daughter, who had slandered an innocent man, and the daughter felt ashamed. The table was soon laid. Kvashin, who smelt of Madeira and liqueurs, and who could scarcely breathe from repletion, complained of being hungry, forced himself to munch, and kept on talking of the meeting of Shipunov's and Ivanchikov's creditors, while his wife and mother-in-law could not take their eyes off his face, and both thought, "How clever and kind he is! How handsome!" "All serene," thought Kvashin as he lay down on the well-filled feather bed. "Though they are regular tradesmen's wives, though they are Philistines, yet they have a charm of their own, and one can spend a day or two of the week here with enjoyment." He wrapped himself up, got warm, and as he dozed off, he said to himself, "All serene." End of Bad Weather, by Anton Pavlovich Chekhov.
Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick Wallace. The opening of Chapter 1 of Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. In Chancery. London. Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney-pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs undistinguishable in mire, horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river, where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the fireside of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may from the spongy fields be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep, to assort with the groping and floundering condition which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. End of the opening of Chapter 1 of Bleak House by Charles Dickens.
Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Champion of the Weather by O. Henry. If you should speak of the Kiowa Reservation to the average New Yorker, he probably wouldn't know whether you were referring to a new political dodge at Albany or a leitmotif from Parsifal. But out in the Kiowa Reservation, advices have been received concerning the existence of New York. A party of us were on a hunting trip in the reservation. Bud Kingsbury, our guide, philosopher, and friend, was broiling antelope steaks in camp one night. One of the party, a pinkish-haired young man in correct hunting costume, sauntered over to the fire to light a cigarette, and remarked carelessly to Bud, "Nice night." "Why, yes," said Bud, "as nice as any night could be that ain't received the Broadway stamp of approval." Now the young man was from New York, but the rest of us wondered how Bud guessed it. So when the steaks were done, we besought him to lay bare his system of ratiocination, and as Bud was something of a territorial talking machine, he made oration as follows. "How did I know he was from New York? Well, I figured it out as soon as he sprung them 2 words on me. I was in New York myself a couple years ago, and I noticed some of the earmarks and hoof tracks of the Rancho Manhattan." "Found New York rather different from the Panhandle, didn't you, Bud?" asked one of the hunters. "Can't say that I did," answered Bud. "Anyways, not more than some. The main trail in that town, which they call Broadway, is plenty traveled, but they're about the same brand of bipeds that tramp around in Cheyenne and Amarillo. At first I was sort of rattled by the crowds, but I soon says to myself, 'Here now, Bud, they're jest plain folks like you and Geronimo and Grover Cleveland and the Watson boys, so don't get all flustered up with consternation under your saddle blanket.' And then I feels calm and peaceful, like I was back in the nation again at a ghost dance or a green corn powwow. I'd been saving up for a year to give this New York a whirl. I knew a man named Summers that lived there, but I couldn't find him, so I played a lone hand at enjoying the intoxicating pleasures of the corn-fed metropolis. For a while I was so frivolous and locoed by the electric lights and the noises of the phonographs and the second-story railroads that I forgot one of the crying needs of my Western system of natural requirements. I never was no hand to deny myself the pleasures of sociable vocal intercourse with friends and strangers. Out in the territories, when I meet a man I never saw before, inside of 9 minutes I know his income, religion, size of collar, and his wife's temper, and how much he pays for clothes, alimony, and chewing tobacco. It's a gift with me not to be penurious with my conversation. But this here New York was inaugurated on the idea of abstemiousness in regard to parts of speech. At the end of 3 weeks nobody in the city had fired even a blank syllable in my direction except the waiter in the grub emporium where I fed. And as his outpourings of syntax wasn't nothing but plagiarisms from the bill of fare, he never satisfied my yearnings, which was to have somebody hit. If I stood next to a man at a bar he'd edge off and give a Baldwin Ziegler look, as if he suspected me of having the North Pole concealed on my person. I began to wish that I'd gone to Abilene or Waco for my paseado, for the mayor of them places will drink with you, and the first citizen you meet will tell you his middle name and ask you to take a chance in the raffle for a music box. Well, one day when I was particular hankerin' for to be gregarious with something more loquacious than a lamp-post, a fellow in a caffy says to me, says he, "Nice day." He was a kind of a manager of the place, and I reckon he'd seen me in there a good many times. He had a face like a fish and an eye like Judas, but I got up and put one arm around his neck. "Pardner," I says, "sure it's a nice day. You're the first gentleman in all New York to observe that the intricacies of human speech might not be altogether wasted on William Kingsbury. But don't you think," says I, "that 'twas a little cool early in the morning, and ain't there a feelin' of rain in the air tonight? But along about noon it sure was galuptious weather. How's all up to the house? You doin' right well with the caffy now?" Well, sir, that galoot just turns his back and walks off stiff without a word, after all my tryin' to be agreeable. I don't know what to make of it. That night I finds a note from Summers, who'd been away from town, givin' the address of his camp. I goes up to his house and has a good old time talk with his folks, and I tells Summers about the actions of this coyote in the caffy, and desires interpretation. "Oh," said Summers, "he wasn't intending to strike up a conversation with you. That's just the New York style. He'd seen you was a regular customer, and he spoke a word or two just to show you he appreciated your custom. You oughtn't to have followed it up. That's about as far as we care to go with a stranger. A word or two about the weather may be ventured, but we don't generally make it the basis of an acquaintance." "Billy," says I, "the weather and its ramifications is a solemn subject with me. Meteorology is one of my sore points. No man can open up the question of temperature or humidity or the glad sunshine with me, and then turn tail on it without its leadin' to a fallin' barometer. I'm goin' down to see that man again and give him a lesson in the art of continuous conversation. You say New York etiquette allows him 2 words and no answer? Well, he's goin' to turn himself into a weather bureau and finish what he begun with me, besides indulgin' in neighborly remarks on other subjects." Summers talked agin it, but I was irritated some, and I went on the street car back to that caffy. The same fellow was there yet, walkin' round in a sort of back corral where there was tables and chairs. A few people was sittin' around havin' drinks and sneering at one another. I called that man to one side and herded him into a corner. I unbuttoned enough to show him a .38 I carried stuck under my vest. "Pardner," I says, "a brief space ago I was in here, and you seized the opportunity to say it was a nice day. When I attempted to corroborate your weather signal, you turned your back on me and walked off. Now," says I, "you frog-hearted, language-shy, stiff-necked cross between a Spitzbergen sea cook and a muzzled oyster, you resume where you left off in your discourse on the weather." The fellow looks at me and tries to grin, but he sees I don't, and he comes around serious. "Well," says he, eyeing the handle of my gun, "it was a rather nice day, some warmish though." "Particulars, you mealy-mouthed snoozer," I says. "Let's have the specifications. Expatiate. Fill in the outlines. When you start anything with me in shorthand it's bound to turn out a storm signal." "Looked like rain yesterday," says the man, "but it cleared off fine in the forenoon. I hear the farmers are needin' rain right badly upstate." "That's the kind of canter," says I. "Shake the New York dust off your hoofs and be a real agreeable kind of centaur. You broke the ice, you know, and we're gettin' better acquainted every minute. Seems to me I asked you about your family." "They're all well, thanks," says he. We have a new piano." "Now you're comin' it," I says. "This cold reserve is breakin' up at last. That little touch about the piano almost makes us brothers. What's the youngest kid's name?" I asks him. "Thomas," says he. "He's just gettin' well from the measles." "I feel like I known you always," says I. "Now there was just one more. Are you doin' right well with the caffy now?" "Pretty well," he says. "I'm puttin' away a little money." "Glad to hear it," says I. "Now go back to your work and get civilized. Keep your hands off the weather unless you're ready to follow it up in a personal manner. It's a subject that naturally belongs to sociability and the forming of new ties, and I hate to see it handed out in small change in a town like this. So the next day I rolls up my blanket and hits the trail away from New York City." For many minutes after Bud ceased talking we lingered around the fire, and then all hands began to disperse for bed. As I was unrolling my bedding I heard the pinkish-haired young man saying to Bud, with something like anxiety in his voice, "As I say, Mr. Kingsbury, there is something really beautiful about this night. The delightful breeze and the bright stars and the clear air unite in making it wonderfully attractive." "Yes," said Bud, "it's a nice night." End of The Champion of the Weather.
Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fog, from Meteorology or Weather Explained, by J. G. McPherson. To many, nothing is more troublesome than a dense fog in a large town. It paralyzes traffic, it is dangerous to pedestrians, it encourages theft, it chokes the asthmatic, and chills the weak-lunged. In the country it is disagreeable enough, but never so intensely raw and dense as in the city. On the sea, too, the fog is disagreeable and fraught with danger. The foghorn is heard in its deep, somber note from the lighthouse tower, when the strong artificial light is almost useless. But a peculiar sense of stagnation possesses the dweller of the large town when enveloped in a dense fog. Sometimes during the day, through a thinner portion, the sun will be dimly seen in copper hue, like the moon under an eclipse. The smoke-impregnated mass assumes a peculiar pea-soup color. Now what is this fog? How is it formed? It has been ascertained that fogs are dependent upon dust for their formation. Without dust there could be no fogs. There would be only dew on the grass and road. Instead of the dust-impregnated air that irritates the housekeeper, there would be the constant dripping of moisture on the walls, which would annoy her more. Ocular demonstration can testify to this. If two closed glass receivers be placed beside each other, the one containing ordinary air and the other filtered air, that is, air deprived of its dust by being driven through cotton wool, and if jets of steam be successively introduced into these, a strange effect is noticed. In the vessel containing common air, the steam will be seen rising into a dense cloud. Then a beautiful white foggy cloud will be formed, so dense that it cannot be seen through. But in the vessel containing the filtered air, the steam is not seen at all. There is not the slightest appearance of cloudiness. In the one case, where there was the ordinary atmospheric dust, fog at once appeared. In the other case, where there was no dust in suspension, the air remained clear and destitute of fog. Invisible dust, then, is necessary in the air for the formation of fogs. The reason of this is that a free surface must exist for the condensation of the vapor particles. The fine particles of dust in the air act as free surfaces on which the fog is formed. Where there is abundance of dust in the air and little water vapor present, there is an overproportion of dust particles, and the fog particles are, in consequence, closely packed, but light in form and small in size, and take the lighter appearance of fog. Accordingly, if the dust is increased in the air, there is a proportionate increase of fog. Every fog particle, then, has embosomed in it an invisible dust particle. But whence comes the dust? From many sources. It is organic and inorganic. So very fine is the inorganic dust in the atmosphere that if the 2,000th part of a grain of fine iron be heated and the dust be driven off and carried into a glass receiver of filtered air, the introduction of a jet of steam into that receiver would at once occasion an appreciable cloudiness. This is why fogs are so prevalent in large towns. Next, the minute brine particles, driven into the air as fog forms above the ocean surface, are the burnt sulfur particles emanating from the chimneys in towns. The brilliant flame, as well as the smoky flame, is a fog producer. If gas is burnt in filtered air, intense fog is produced when water vapor is introduced. Products of combustion from a clear fire and from a smoky one produce equal fogging. The fogs that densely fill our large towns are generally less bearable than those that veil the hills and overhang the rivers. It is the sulfur, however, from the consumed coals, which is the active producer of the fogs of a large town. The burnt sulfur condenses in the air to very fine particles, and the quantity of burnt sulfur is enormous. No less than 7.5 millions of tons of coals are consumed in London. Now the average amount of sulfur in English coal is 1.25%. That would give no less than 93,750 tons of sulfur burned every year in London fires. Now if we reckon that on an average twice the quantity of coals is consumed there on a winter day that is consumed on a summer day, no less than 347 tons of the products of combustion in extremely fine particles are driven into the superincumbent air of London every winter day. This is an enormous quantity, quite sufficient to account for the density of the fogs in that city. End of fog.
Coffee Break Collection 13. Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Frost Spirit by John Greenleaf Whittier. He comes, the Frost Spirit comes. You may trace his footsteps now on the naked woods and the blasted fields and the brown hill's weathered brow. He has smitten the leaves of the gray old trees where their pleasant green came forth, and the winds, which follow wherever he goes, have shaken them down to earth. He comes, the Frost Spirit comes, from the frozen Labrador, from the icy bridge of the northern seas which the white bear wanders o'er, where the fisherman's sail is stiff with ice, and the luckless forms below in the sunless cold of the lingering night into marble statues grow. He comes, the Frost Spirit comes, on the rushing northern blast, and the dark Norwegian pines have bowed as his fearful breath went past. With an unscorched wing he has hurried on, where the fires of Hecla glow on the darkly beautiful sky above, and the ancient ice below. He comes, the Frost Spirit comes, and the quiet lake shall feel the torpid touch of his glazing breath, and ring to the skater's heel, and the streams which danced on the broken rocks or sang to the leaning grass shall bow again to their winter chain, and in mournful silence pass. He comes, the Frost Spirit comes. Let us meet him as we may, and turn with the light of the parlor fire his evil power away, and gather closer the circle round, when the firelight dances high, and laugh at the shriek of the baffled fiend as his sounding wing goes by. End of The Frost Spirit by John Greenleaf Whittier. Recording by Philip Gould. Coffee Break Collection 13. Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. If Mr. Wilson Were the Weatherman by Christopher Morley. My fellow citizens, it is very delightful to be here, if I may be permitted to say so, and I consider it a distinguished privilege to open the discussion as to the probable weather tomorrow not only, but during the days to come. I can easily conceive that many of our forecasts will need subsequent reconsideration, for, if I may judge by my own study of these matters, the climate is not susceptible of confident judgments at present. An overwhelming majority of the American people is in favor of fine weather. This underlying community of purpose warms my heart. If we do not guarantee them fine weather, can you not see the picture of what would come to pass? Your hearts have instructed you where the rain falls. It falls upon the senators and congressmen not only, and for that we need not feel so much chagrin. It falls upon humble homes everywhere, upon plain men and women and children. If I were to disappoint the united expectation of my fellow citizens for fine weather tomorrow, I would incur their merited scorn. I suppose no more delicate task is given to any man than to interpret the feelings and purposes of a great climate. It is not a task in which any man can find much exhilaration, and I confess I have been puzzled by some of the criticisms leveled at my office. But they do not make any impression on me, because I know that the sentiment of the country at large will be more generous. I call my fellow countrymen to witness that at no stage of the recent period of low barometric pressure have I judged the purposes of the climate intemperately. I should be ashamed to use the weak language of vindictive protest. I have tried once and again, my fellow citizens, to say to you in all frankness what seems to be the prospect of fine weather. There is a compulsion upon one in my position to exercise every effort to see that as little as possible of the hope of mankind is disappointed. Yet this is a hope which cannot in the very nature of things be realized in its perfection. The utmost that can be done by way of accommodation and compromise has been performed without stint or limit. I am sure it will not be necessary to remind you that you cannot throw off the habits of the climate immediately, any more than you can throw off the habits of the individual immediately. But however unpromising the immediate outlook may be, I am the more happy to offer my observations on the state of the weather for tomorrow, because this is not a party issue. What a delightful thought that is! Whatever the condition of sunshine or precipitation vouchsafed to us, may I not hope that we shall all meet it with quickened temper and purpose, happy in the thought that it is our common fortune? For tomorrow there is every prospect of heavy and continuous rain. End of If Mr. Wilson Were the Weatherman, by Christopher Morley. Recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 13. Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA. The Legend of King Wenceslas, A Legend of Mercy, by John Mason Neal. Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of St. Stephen, when the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. King Wenceslas sat in his palace. He had been watching from the narrow window of the turret chamber where he was. The sunset, as its glory hung for a moment in the western clouds, and then died away over the blue hills. Calm and cold was the brightness. A freezing haze came over the face of the land. The moon brightened towards the southwest, and the leafless trees in the castle gardens and the quaint turret and spires of the castle itself threw clear dark shadows on the unspotted snow. Still the king looked out upon the scene before him. The ground sloped down from the castle towards the forest. Here and there on the side of the hill a few bushes gray with moss broke the unvaried sheet of white, and as the king turned his eye in that direction, a poor man came up to these bushes and pulled something from them. "Come hither, page," called the king. One of the servants of the palace entered in answer to the king's call. "Come, my good Otto, come, stand by me. Do you see yonder poor man on the hillside? Step down to him, and learn who he is, and where he dwells, and what he is doing. Bring me word at once." Otto went forth on his errand, while the good king watched him go down the hill. Meanwhile the frost grew more and more intense, and an east wind blew from the black mountains. The snow became more crisp, and the air more clear. In a few moments the messenger was back. "Well, who is he?" "Sire," said Otto, "it is Rudolf the swineherd, he that lives down by the Brunweis. Fire he has none, nor food, and he was gathering a few sticks where he might find them, lest, as he says, all his family perish with the cold. It is a most bitter night, sire." "This should have been better looked to," said the king. "A grievous fault it is that it has not been done, but it shall be amended now. Go to the Uri, Otto, and fetch some provisions of the best."
Bring me flesh and bring me wine, bring me pine logs hither. Thou and I will see him dine when we bear them hither. Is your majesty going forth? Asked Otto in surprise. Yes, to the Brunwise, and you shall go with me. When you have everything ready, meet me at the woodstacks by the little chapel. Come, be speedy. I pray you, sire, do not venture out yourself. Let some of the men-at-arms go forth. It is a freezing wind, and the place is a good league hence. Nevertheless, I go, said the king. Go with me if you will, Otto. If not, stay. I can carry the food myself. God forbid, sire, that I should let you go alone, but I pray you be persuaded. Not in this, said King Wenceslas. Meet me then where I said, and not a word to any one besides. The noblemen of the court were in the palace hall, where a mighty fire went roaring up the chimney, and the shadows played and danced on the steep sides of the dark roof. Gaily they laughed, and lightly they talked, and as they threw fresh logs into the great chimney-place, one said to another that so bitter a wind had never before been known in the land. But in the midst of that freezing night, the king went forth. Page and monarch forth they went together, through the rude wind's wild lament and the bitter weather. The king had put on no extra clothing to shelter himself from the nipping air, for he would feel with the poor that he might feel for them. On his shoulders he bore a heap of logs for the swineherd's fire. He stepped briskly on, while Otto followed with the provisions. He had imitated his master, and had gone out in his common garments. On the two trudged together over the crisp snow, across fields, by lanes where the hedge-trees were heavy with their white burden, past the pool, over the stile where the rime clustered thick by the wood, and on out upon the moor, where the snow lay yet more unbroken, and where the wind seemed to nip one's very heart. Still King Wenceslas went on, and still Otto followed. The king thought it but little to go forth into the frost and snow, remembering him who came into the cold night of this world of ours. He disdained not, a king, to go to the beggar, for had not the King of Kings visited slaves? He grudged not, a king, to carry logs on his shoulders, for had not the King of Kings borne heavier burdens for his sake? But at each step Otto's courage and zeal failed. He tried to hold out with a good heart. For very shame he did not wish to do less than his master. How could he turn back, while the king held on his way? But when they came forth on the white, bleak moor, he cried out with a faint heart, "My liege, I cannot go on. The wind freezes my very blood. Pray you, let us return." "Seems it so much?" asked the king. "Follow me on still. Only tread in my footsteps, and you will proceed more easily." The servant knew that his master spoke not at random. He carefully looked for the footsteps of the king. He set his own feet in the print of his master's. In the master's steps he trod, where the snow lay dinted. Heat was in the very sod which the saint had printed. And so great was the fire of love that kindled in the heart of the king, that as the servant trod in his steps, he gained life and heat. Otto felt not the wind, he heeded not the frost, for the master's footprints glowed as with the holy fire, and zealously he followed the king on his errand of mercy. End of the Legend of King Wenceslas. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA.
Coffee Break Collection 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of the natural causes and original of winds. From the historical narrative of the Great Storm, November 26, 1703. By Gideon Harvey, 1736 to 1702. The wind bloweth where it listeth, thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh. John 3, verse 8. In searching after causes, we may at any time resolve all things into infinite power. We allow the mighty first cause of nature, but the treasury of immediate causes is what philosophy explores. If at any time we look beyond that, it is because we are out of the way. It is not because the object of our search is not there, but because we cannot find it. The philosopher's business is not to extend his inquiries to the operations of infinite power. His business is with nature. There grows what he looks for, and it is there he must find it. Philosophy is aground when forced to further researches. It is not enough for the astronomer to know that God has made the heavens, the sun, the moon, and all the stars. He must search for the causes, motions, and influences among the heavenly bodies. What are their functions and ends of their being? He must inform himself where they are placed and why there. The anatomist is not satisfied to know that he is fearfully and wonderfully made in the lowermost parts of the earth, but he must see those lowermost parts, search into the method nature proceeds upon its performing the office appointed, must watch the steps she takes, and mark the tools she works with. He will endeavor after the most exquisite discoveries of the human body, and all the vessels of life and sense, with their proper dimensions and uses. In short, every philosopher will endeavor to know all that the God of nature has permitted to be capable of demonstration. To search after what our Maker has not hid, only covered with a thin veil of natural obscurity, and which upon our search is plain to be read, seems to be justified by the very nature of the thing, and the possibility of the demonstration is an argument to prove the lawfulness of the inquiry. Air, the general menstruum and seminary, seemeth to be not only an aggregate of the volatile parts of all natural beings, which variously combined and agitated produce various effects. Small particles in a near and close situation strongly act upon each other, attracting, repelling, vibrating. Hence diverse fermentations and all the variety of meteors, tempests, and concussions, both of earth and firmament. The demonstrations made of rarefaction and dilation are extraordinary. Lord Verulam's experiments on feathers proves that by fire and water wind may be raised in a close room. There is no effect in nature greater marvellous or terrible, but proceeds from fire, that diffused and active principle, which at the same time that it shakes the earth and heavens, will enter, divide, and dissolve the smallest, closest, and most compacted bodies. In remote cavities of the earth it remains quiet, till perhaps an accidental spark from the collision of one stone against another kindles an exhalation that gives birth to an earthquake or a tempest, which splits mountains or overturns cities. Upon the whole, it appears that the winds are a part of the works of God by nature, in which he has been pleased to communicate less of demonstration to us than in many other cases. They therefore refer us to infinite power more than the other parts of nature do. The Christian begins where the philosopher ends. When the inquirer turns his eyes to heaven, farewell philosophy. When nothing can be made of the inquiry here, then we are forced to cry out, Lord, what is man? As the dreadful hurricane, the dismal effects of which we propose to relate, was first felt from the west, some have conjectured that the first generation or collection of materials was from the continent of America, possibly from that part of Florida and Virginia where the confluence of vapors raised by the sun from the vast lakes and inland seas of water, which are incredibly large as well as numerous, might afford sufficient matter for the tempest, and where, time adding to the preparation, God, who confined his providence to the chain of natural causes, might muster together those troops of combustion till they made a sufficient army duly proportioned to the expedition designed. This opinion is the more probable because they felt an unusual tempest a few days before the fatal 27th of November. He must have studied the motion of the clouds very nicely. Who can calculate how long this army of terror might take up in its furious march? Possibly the velocity of its motion might not be so great at first setting out as it was afterward, though it may be true that by the length of the way the force of the wind spends itself, and so by degrees ceases as the vapors find more room for dilation. Yet we may suppose a conjunction of some considerable matter which might fall in with this by the way, or which, meeting at its arrival here, might join forces in executing the commission received from above. Yet the vast collection of matter did not all take motion in one and the same moment, for as they advanced and pressed those before them, the violence increased in proportion, and thus we may conceive that the motion might not have arrived at its meridian violence till it reached our island. And even then it blew some days, yet much less than that last night of its force. And even that night the violence was not at its extremity till about an hour before sunrise, and then it continued declining, though it blew a full storm for 4 days after. As our island was the first this way to receive the impression of the violent hurricane, it had the most terrible effects here, and continuing its steady course, we find it carried a true line clear over the continent of Europe, traversing England, France, Germany, the Baltic Sea, and passing the northern continents of Sweden, Finland, Muscovy, and part of Tartary, must at last lose itself in the vast northern ocean, where ships never sailed. As its violence could have no effect there upon the vast mountains of ice and the huge drifts of snow, in this abyss of moisture and cold, it is very probable the force of it was checked, and the world restored to calmness and quiet. In this circle of fury we find its end not far off from whence it had its beginning, the fierceness of the motion perhaps not arriving to a period till, having passed the pole, it reached again the northern parts of America. End of The Natural Causes and Original of Winds, by Gideon Harvey, 1636 to 1702.
Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Racing an Avalanche by Enos A. Mills. I had gone into the San Juan Mountains during the first week in March to learn something of the laws which govern snow slides, to get a fuller idea of their power and destructiveness, and also with the hope of seeing them in wild, magnificent action. Everywhere, except on wind-swept points, the winter's snows lay deep. Conditions for slide movement were so favorable it seemed probable that during the next few days at least one would run or shoot down every gulch that led from the summit. I climbed on skis well to the top of the range. By waiting on spurs and ridges I saw several thrilling exhibitions. It was an exciting experience, but at the close of one great day the clear weather that had prevailed came to an end. From the table-like summit I watched hundreds of splendid clouds slowly advance, take their places, mass, and form fluffy seas in valley and canyons just below my level. They submerged the low places in the plateau, and torn silver-gray masses of mists surrounded crags and headlands. The sunset promised to be wonderful, but suddenly the mists came surging past my feet and threatened to shut out the view. Hurriedly climbing a promontory, I watched from it a many-colored sunset change and fade over mist-wreathed spires and swelling peak-torn seas. But the cloud masses were rising, and suddenly points and peaks began to settle out of sight, then a dash of frosty mists, and my promontory sank into the sea. The light vanished from the heights, and I was caught in dense, frosty clouds and winter snows without a star. I had left my skis at the foot of the promontory, and had climbed up by fingers and toes over the rocks without great difficulty, but on starting to return I could see only a few inches into the frosty sheep's wool clouds, and quickly found that trying to get down would be a perilous pastime. The side of the promontory stood over the steep walls of the plateau, and not caring to be tumbled overboard by a slip, I concluded that sunrise from this point would probably be worth while. It was not bitter cold, and I was comfortably dressed. However, it was necessary to do much dancing and arm swinging to keep warm. Snow began to fall just after the clouds closed in, and it fell rapidly without a pause until near morning. Early in the evening I began a mental review of a number of subjects, mingling with these, from time to time, vigorous practice of gymnastics or calisthenics to help pass the night and to aid in keeping warm. The first subject I thought through was Arctic exploration. Then I recalled all that my mind had retained of countless stories of mountain climbing experiences. The contents of Tyndall's Hours of Exercise in the Alps was most clearly recalled. I was enjoying the poetry of Burns when broken clouds and a glowing eastern sky claimed all attention until it was light enough to get off the promontory. Planning to go down the west side, I crossed the table-like top, found, after many trials, a break in the enormous snow cornice, and started down the steep slope. It was a dangerous descent, for the rock was steep and smooth as a wall, and was overladen with snow which might slip at any moment. I descended slowly and with great caution, so as not to start the snow, as well as to guard against slipping and losing control of myself. It was like descending a mile of steep, snow-covered barn roof, nothing to lay hold of, and omnipresent opportunity for slipping. A short distance below the summit, the clouds again were around me, and I could see only a short distance. I went sideways with my long skis, which I had now regained, at right angles to the slope. Slowly, a few inches at a time, I eased myself down, planting one ski firmly before I moved the other. At last I reached a point where the wall was sufficiently tilted to be called a slope, though it was still too steep for safe coasting. The clouds lifted and were floating away, while the sun made the mountains of snow still whiter. I paused to look back and up to where the wall ended in the blue sky, and could not understand how I had come safely down, even with the long tacks I had made, which showed clearly up to the snow-corniced, mist-shrouded crags at the summit. I had come down the side of a precipitous amphitheatre which rose 1,000 feet or more above me. A short distance down the mountain the slopes of this amphitheatre concentrated in a narrow gulch that extended 2 miles or more. Altogether it was like being in an enormous frying pan lying face up. I was in the pan just above the place where the gulch handle joined. It was a bad place to get out of, and thousands of tons of snow clinging to the steeps and sagging from cornice crests, ready to slip, plunge down, and sweep the very spot on which I stood, showed most impressively that it was a perilous place to be in. As I stood gazing upward and wondering how the snow ever could have held while I came down this cloud over the crest in an inverted cascade, all this showed for a few seconds, until the snowy spray began to separate and vanish in the air. The snow clouds settled downward and began to roll forward. Then monsters of massed snow appeared beneath the front of the cloud and plunged down the slopes. Wildly, grandly they dragged the entire snow cloud in their wake. At the same instant the remainder of the snow cornice was suddenly enveloped in another explosive snow cloud effect. A general slide had started. I whirled to escape, pointed my skis down the slope, and went. In less than half a minute a tremendous snow avalanche, 100 or perhaps 200 feet deep and 500 or 600 feet long, thundered over the spot where I had stood. There was no chance to dodge, no time to climb out of the way. The only hope of escape lay in outrunning the magnificent monster. It came crashing and thundering after me, as swift as a gale, and more all-sweeping and destructive than an earthquake tidal wave. I made a desperate start. Friction almost ceases to be a factor with skis on a snowy steep, and in less than 100 yards I was going like the wind. For the first quarter of a mile to the upper end of the gulch was smooth coasting, and down this I shot, with the avalanche, comet-tailed with snow dust in close pursuit. A race for life was on. The gulch down which I must go began with a rocky gorge and continued downward, an enormous U-shaped depression between high mountain ridges. Here and there it expanded and then contracted, and it was broken with granite crags and ribs. It was piled and bristled with 10,000 fire-killed trees. To coast through all these snow-clad obstructions at breakneck speed would be taking the maximum number of life and death chances in the minimum amount of time. The worst of it all was that I had never been through the place, and bad enough too was the fact that a ridge thrust in from the left and completely hid the beginning of the gulch. As I shot across the lower point of the ridge, about to plunge blindly into the gorge, I thought of the possibility of becoming entangled in the hedge-like thickets of dwarfed, gnarled, timber-lined trees. I also realized that I might dash against a cliff or plunge into a deep cañon. Of course I might strike an open way, but certain it was that I could not stop, nor see the beginning of the gorge, nor tell what I should strike when I shot over the ridge. It was a second of most intense concern, as I cleared the ridge blindly to go into what lay below and beyond. It was like leaping into the dark, and with the leap turning on the all-revealing light. As I cleared the ridge, there was just time to pull myself together for a 40-odd-foot leap, across one arm of the horseshoe-shaped end of the gorge. In all my wild mountainside coasts on skis, never have I sped as swiftly as when I made this mad flight. As I shot through the air, I had a glimpse down into the pointed, snow-laden tops of a few tall fir trees that were firmly rooted among the rocks in the bottom of the gorge. Luckily, I cleared the gorge and landed in a good place, but so narrowly did I miss the corner of a cliff that my shadow collided with it. There was no time to bid farewell to fears when the slide started, nor to entertain them while running away from it. Instinct put me to flight. The situation set my wits working at their best, and once started, I could neither stop nor look back, and so thick and fast did obstructions and dangers rise before me that only dimly and incidentally did I think of the oncoming danger behind. I came down on the farther side of the gorge to glance forward like an arrow. There was only an instant to shape my course and direct my flight across the second arm of the gorge, over which I leaped from a high place, sailing far above the snow-mantled trees and boulders in the bottom. My senses were keenly alert, and I remember noticing the shadows of the fir trees on the white snow, and hearing, while still in the air, the brave, cheery notes of a chickadee. Then the snowslide on my trail, less than 1/8 of a mile behind, plunged into the gorge with a thundering crash. I came back to the snow on the lower side and went skimming down the slope with the slide, only a few seconds behind. Fortunately, most of the fallen masses of trees were buried, though a few broken limbs peeped through the snow to snag or trip me. How I ever dodged my way through the thickly standing tree growths is one feature of the experience that was too swift for recollection. Numerous factors presented themselves which should have done much to dispel mental procrastination and develop decision. There were scores of progressive propositions to decide within a few seconds. Should I dodge that tree on the left side and duck under low limbs just beyond, or dodge to the right and scrape that pike of rocks? These, with my speed, required instant decision and action. With almost uncontrollable rapidity, I shot out into a small, nearly level glacier meadow, and had a brief rest from swift decisions and oncoming dangers. How relieved my weary brain felt, with nothing to decide about dodging. As though starved for thought material, I wondered if there were willows buried beneath the snow. Sharp pains in my left hand compelled attention, and showed my left arm drawn tightly against my breast, with fingers and thumb spread to the fullest, and all their muscles tense. The lower edge of the meadow was almost blockaded with a dense growth of fire-killed trees. Fortunately, the easy slope here had so checked my speed that I was able to dodge safely through, but the heavy slide swept across the meadow after me with undiminished speed, and came crashing into the dead trees so close to me that broken limbs were flung flying past as I shot down off a steep moraine less than 100 feet ahead. All the way down I had hoped to find a side cañon into which I might dodge. I was going too rapidly to enter the one I had seen. As I coasted the moraine, it flashed through my mind that I had once heard a prospector say it was only a quarter of a mile from Aspen Gulch up to the meadows. Aspen Gulch came in on the right, as the now slightly widening track seemed to indicate. At the bottom of the moraine I was forced between two trees that stood close together, and a broken limb of one pierced my open coat just beneath the left armhole and slit the coat to the bottom. My momentum and the resistance of the strong material gave me such a shock that I was flung off my balance and my left ski smashed against a tree. 2 feet of the heel was broken off and the remainder split. I managed to avoid falling, but had to check my speed with my staff for fear of a worse accident. Battling breakers with a broken oar or racing with a broken ski are struggles of short duration. The slide did not slow down, and so closely did it crowd me that through the crashing of trees as it struck them down, I could hear the rocks and splintered timbers in its mass grinding together and thudding against obstructions over which it swept. These sounds and flying broken limbs cried to me "faster," and as I started to descend another steep moraine, I threw away my staff and let go. I simply flashed down the slope, dodged and rounded a cliff, turned awkwardly into Aspen Gulch, and tumbled heels over head into safety. Then I picked myself up to see the slide go by within 20 feet, with great broken trees sticking out of its side, and a snow cloud dragging above. End of Racing an Avalanche.
Coffee Break Collection 13. Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Remarkable Thunderstorm by William Wallace Campbell. The thunderstorm, which occurred shortly after midnight of February the 18th 19th, gave an exhibition of fireworks and noise which the Lick Observatory community will never forget. The conditions were very dramatic. When I was first awakened, the interval between the flash and the thunder was 10 seconds. Then it was successively 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and 4 seconds. This meant that the storm was approaching us and that the electrical discharges were less than a mile away. Next the interval was 3 seconds, and I felt sure that we were in for trouble. The 2 following discharges were 2 seconds or less away, and it is probable that these were the ones which connected with the steel dome of the 36-inch refractor. A few seconds later there were 2 discharges which must have hit the hill on which my residence stands, Ptolemy, for the swish of the discharges through the air was heard a minute fraction of a second before the blinding flash and the deafening crash occurred, the flash and the crash being simultaneous. Having paid its compliments, the storm continued on its way, with increasing time intervals between flash and report. The lightning struck many times within the region occupied by the observatory buildings and residences. The great dome was struck once certainly, and twice probably. A small fire was started at a harmless point in the basement of the great dome. It was found promptly, and put out without effort or excitement. The electric lighting and power plant and the telephone system were early put out of commission. Fuses were melted in all of the buildings, and many electric lamps were exploded. Coils in several of the electric motors were burned out, copper wires were melted here and there, and all of the meters which measure the flow of current in the various buildings were damaged. Fortunately, there was no personal injury. California is remarkably free from thunderstorms, except in the high Sierras, and it was quite out of harmony with our traditions that Mount Hamilton should have serious trouble from this source. We are considering ways and means of future protection against lightning. Lightning discharges on Mount Hamilton seem to be closely associated with sleet storms. The disturbance of February 18th to 19th was accompanied by a downfall of diminutive hailstones. The ground was covered with ice balls a quarter of an inch or less in diameter. I recall that on 2 or 3 former occasions a fall of sleet was accompanied in each case by a single sharp discharge of lightning, which occurred without warning and did not repeat itself. W. W. Campbell. End of A Remarkable Thunderstorm.
Coffee Break Collection 13. Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Speech on the Weather by Mark Twain. Speech on the Weather at the New England Society's 71st Annual Dinner, New York City. The next toast was, "The oldest inhabitant, the weather of New England. Who can lose it and forget it? Who can have it and regret it? Be interposer twixt us twain." Merchant of Venice. To this Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain replied as follows. I reverently believe that the Maker who made us all makes everything in New England but the weather. I don't know who makes that, but I think it must be raw apprentices in the weather clerk's factory who experiment and learn how, in New England, for board and clothes, and then are promoted to make weather for countries that require a good article, and will take their custom elsewhere if they don't get it. There is a sumptuous variety about the New England weather that compels the stranger's admiration and regret. The weather is always doing something there, always attending strictly to business, always getting up new designs and trying them on the people to see how they will go. But it gets through more business in spring than in any other season. In the spring I have counted 136 different kinds of weather inside of 24 hours. It was I that made the fame and fortune of that man that had that marvelous collection of weather on exhibition at the Centennial, that so astounded the foreigners. He was going to travel all over the world and get specimens from all the climes. I said, "Don't you do it. You come to New England on a favorable spring day." I told him what we could do in the way of style, variety, and quantity. Well, he came, and he made his collection in 4 days. As to variety, why, he confessed that he got hundreds of kinds of weather that he had never heard of before. And as to quantity, well, after he had picked out and discarded all that was blemished in any way, he not only had weather enough, but weather to spare, weather to hire out, weather to sell, to deposit, weather to invest, weather to give to the poor. The people of New England are by nature patient and forbearing, but there are some things which they will not stand. Every year they kill a lot of poets for writing about beautiful spring. These are generally casual visitors who bring their notions of spring from somewhere else, and cannot, of course, know how the natives feel about spring. And so the first thing they know the opportunity to inquire how they feel has permanently gone by. Old Probabilities has a mighty reputation for accurate prophecy, and thoroughly well deserves it. You take up the paper and observe how crisply and confidently he checks off what today's weather is going to be on the Pacific, down south, in the Middle States, in the Wisconsin region. See him sail along in the joy and pride of his power till he gets to New England, and then see his tail drop. He doesn't know what the weather is going to be in New England. Well, he mulls it over, and by he gets out something about this: probable northeast to southwest winds, varying to the southward and westward and eastward, and points between, high and low barometer swapping around from place to place. Probable areas of rain, snow, hail, and drought, succeeded or preceded by earthquakes with thunder and lightning. Then he jots down this postscript from his wandering mind to cover accidents. But it is possible that the program may be wholly changed in the meantime. Yes, one of the brightest gems in the New England weather is the dazzling uncertainty of it. There is only one thing certain about it. You are certain there is going to be plenty of it, a perfect grand review. But you never can tell which end of the procession is going to move first. You fix up for the drought, you leave your umbrella in the house and sally out, and 2 to 1 you get drowned. You might make up your mind that the earthquake is due. You stand from under, and you take hold of something to steady yourself, and the first thing you know, you get struck by lightning. These are great disappointments, but they can't be helped. The lightning there is peculiar. It is so convincing that when it strikes a thing, it doesn't leave enough of that thing behind for you to tell whether, well, you'd think it was something valuable, and a congressman had been there. And the thunder, when the thunder begins to merely tune up and scrape and saw, and key up the instruments for the performance, strangers say, "Why, what awful thunder you have here!" But when the baton is raised and the real concert begins, you'll find that stranger down in the cellar with his head in the ash barrel. Now as to the size of the weather in New England lengthways, it is utterly disproportioned to the size of that little country. Half the time when it is packed as full as it can stick, you will see that New England weather sticking out beyond the edges and projecting around hundreds and hundreds of miles over the neighboring states. You can't hold a 10th part of her weather. You can see cracks all about where she has strained herself trying to do it. I could speak volumes about the inhumane perversity of the New England weather, but I will give but a single specimen. I like to hear it rain on a tin roof, so I covered part of my roof with tin, with an eye to that luxury. Well, sir, do you think it ever rains on that tin? No, sir, skips it every time. Mind, in this speech I have been merely trying to do honor to the New England weather. No language could do it justice. But, after all, there is at least 1 or 2 things about the weather, or, if you please, effects produced by it, which we residents should not like to part with. If we hadn't our bewitching autumn foliage, we should still have to credit the weather with one feature which compensates for all its bullying vagaries, the ice storm. When a leafless tree is clothed with ice from the bottom to the top, ice that is as bright and clear as crystal, when every bough and twig is strung with ice beads, frozen dewdrops, and the whole tree sparkles cold and white, like the Shah of Persia's diamond plume. Then the wind waves the branches, and the sun comes out and turns all those myriads of beads and drops to prisms that glow and burn and flash with all manner of colored fires, which change and change again, with inconceivable rapidity from blue to red, from red to green, and green to gold. The tree becomes a spraying fountain, a very explosion of dazzling jewels, and it stands there, the acme, the climax, the supremest possibility in nature or art, of bewildering, intoxicating, intolerable magnificence. One cannot make the words too strong. End of speech on the weather. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America.
Coffee Break Collection 13, Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit
LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. Storm and Sunlight by Siegfried Sassoon. 1. In barns we crouch, and under stacks of straw, harking the storm that rides a hurtling legion up the arched sky, and speeds quick heels of panic, with growling thunder loosed in fork and clap that echoes crashing through the slumberous vault. The whispering woodlands darken, vulture gloom stoops, menacing the skeltering flocks of light, where the gaunt shepherd shakes his gleaming staff and foots with angry tidings down the slope. Drip, drip, the rain steals in through soaking thatch by cobwebbed rafters to the dusty floor. Drums shatter and the tumult, wrathful chaos points pealing din to the zenith, then resolves terror and wonderment with rich collapse. 2. Now from drenched eaves a swallow darts to skim the crystal stillness of an air unveiled to tremulous blue. Raise your bowed heads, and let your horns adore the sky, ye patient kine. Haste, flashing brooks, small, chuckling rills, rejoice. Be open-eyed for heaven, ye pools of peace. Shine, rainbow hills. Dream on, fair glimpsed vale, in haze of drifting gold. And all sweet birds, sing out your raptures to the radiant leaves. And ye, close huddling men, come forth to stand a moment simple in the gaze of God that sweeps along your pastures. Breathe His might. Lift your blind faces to be filled with day, and share His benediction with the flowers. End of Storm and Sunlight.
Typhoon Off the Coast of Japan by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in October 2017. Typhoon Off the Coast of Japan by Jack London. It was 4 bells in the morning watch. We had just finished breakfast when the order came forward for the watch on deck to stand by to heave her to, and all hands stand by the boats. "Port! Hard a port!" cried our sailing master. "Clew up the topsails! Let the flying jib run down! Back the jib over to windward and run down the foresail!" And so was our schooner Sophie Sutherland hove to off the Japan coast near Cape Jerimo on April 10, 1893. Then came moments of bustle and confusion. There were 18 men to man the 6 boats. Some were hooking on the falls, others casting off the lashings. Boat steerers appeared with boat compasses and water breakers, and boat pullers with the lunch boxes. Hunters were staggering under 2 or 3 shotguns, a rifle and heavy ammunition box, all of which were soon stowed away with their oilskins and mittens in the boats. The sailing master gave his last orders, and away we went, pulling 3 pairs of oars to gain our positions. We were in the weather boat, and so had a longer pull than the others. The first, second, and third lee boats soon had all sail set, and were running off to the southward and westward with the wind beam, while the schooner was running off to leeward of them, so that in case of accident the boats would have fair wind home. It was a glorious morning, but our boat steerer shook his head ominously as he glanced at the rising sun and prophetically muttered, "Red sun in the morning, sailor take warning." The sun had an angry look, and a few light, fleecy nigger-heads in that quarter seemed abashed and frightened, and soon disappeared. Away off to the northward, Cape Jerimo reared its black, forbidding head like some huge monster rising from the deep. The winter's snow, not yet entirely dissipated by the sun, covered it in patches of glistening white, over which the light wind swept on its way out to sea. Huge gulls rose slowly, fluttering their wings in the light breeze, and striking their webbed feet on the surface of the water for over half a mile before they could leave it. Hardly had the patter-patter died away, when a flock of sea-quail rose, and with whistling wings flew away to windward, where members of a large band of whales were disporting themselves, their blowings sounding like the exhaust of steam-engines. The harsh, discordant cries of a sea-parrot grated unpleasantly on the ear, and set half a dozen alert in a small band of seals that were ahead of us. Away they went, breaching and jumping entirely out of water. A seagull with slow, deliberate flight and long, majestic curves circled round us, and as a reminder of home a little English sparrow perched impudently on the forecastle's head, and, cocking his head on one side, chirped merrily. The boats were soon among the seals, and the bang-bang of the guns could be heard from down to leeward. The wind was slowly rising, and by 3 o'clock, as, with a dozen seals in our boats, we were deliberating whether to go on or turn back, the recall flag was run up at the schooner's mizzen, a sure sign that with the rising wind the barometer was falling, and that our sailing-master was getting anxious for the welfare of the boats. Away we went before the wind with a single reef in our sail. With clenched teeth sat the boat-steerer, grasping the steering oar firmly with both hands, his restless eyes on the alert, a glance at the schooner ahead as we rose on a sea, another at the main-sheet, and then one astern where the dark ripple of the wind on the water told him of a coming puff or a large white-cap that threatened to overwhelm us. The waves were holding high carnival, performing the strangest antics, as with wild glee they danced along in fierce pursuit, now up, now down, here, there, and everywhere, until some great sea of liquid green with its milk-white crest of foam rose from the ocean's throbbing bosom and drove the others from view. But only for a moment, for again under new forms they reappeared. In the sun's path they wandered, where every ripple, great or small, every little spit or spray looked like molten silver, where the water lost its dark green color and became a dazzling silvery flood, only to vanish and become a wild waste of sudden turbulence, each dark foreboding sea rising and breaking, then rolling on again. The dash, the sparkle, the silvery light soon vanished with the sun, which became obscured by black clouds that were rolling swiftly in from the west-northwest, apt heralds of the coming storm. We soon reached the schooner and found ourselves the last aboard. In a few minutes the seals were skinned, boats and decks washed, and we were down below by the roaring forecastle fire, with a wash, change of clothes, and a hot, substantial supper before us. Sail had been put on the schooner, as we had a run of 75 miles to make to the southward before morning, so as to get in the midst of the seals, out of which we had strayed during the last 2 days' hunting. We had the first watch from 8 to midnight. The wind was soon blowing half a gale, and our sailing-master expected little sleep that night, as he paced up and down the poop. The topsails were soon clewed up and made fast, then the flying jib run down and furled. Quite a sea was rolling by this time, occasionally breaking over the decks, flooding them and threatening to smash the boats. At 6 bells we were ordered to turn them over and put on storm lashings. This occupied us till 8 bells, when we were relieved by the mid-watch. I was the last to go below, doing so just as the watch on deck was furling the spanker. Below all were asleep except our green hand, the bricklayer, who was dying of consumption. The wildly dancing movements of the sea-lamp cast a pale, flickering light through the forecastle, and turned to golden honey the drops of water on the yellow oilskins. In all the corners dark shadows seemed to come and go, while up in the eyes of her, beyond the pall bits, descending from deck to deck, where they seemed to lurk like some dragon at the cavern's mouth, it was dark as Erebus. Now and again the light seemed to penetrate for a moment as the schooner rolled heavier than usual, only to recede, leaving it darker and blacker than before. The roar of the wind through the rigging came to the ear muffled like the distant rumble of a train crossing a trestle or the surf on the beach, while the loud crash of the seas on her weather bow seemed almost to rend the beams and planking asunder as it resounded through the forecastle. The creaking and groaning of the timbers, stanchions, and bulkheads, as the strain the vessel was undergoing was felt, served to drown the groans of the dying man as he tossed uneasily in his bunk. The working of the foremast against the deck beams caused a shower of flaking powder to fall, and sent another sound mingling with the tumultuous storm. Small cascades of water streamed from the pall bits from the forecastle head above, and, joining issue with the streams from the wet oilskins, ran along the floor and disappeared aft into the main hold. At 2 bells in the middle watch, that is, in land parlance 1 o'clock in the morning, the order was roared out on the forecastle, "All hands on deck and shorten sail." Then the sleepy sailors tumbled out of their bunk and into their clothes, oilskins and sea boots, and up on deck. 'Tis when that order comes on cold, blustering nights that Jack grimly mutters, "Who would not sell a farm and go to sea?" It was on deck that the force of the wind could be fully appreciated, especially after leaving the stifling forecastle. It seemed to stand up against you like a wall, making it almost impossible to move on the heaving decks or to breathe as the fierce gusts came dashing by. The schooner was hove to under jib, foresail, and mainsail. We proceeded to lower the foresail and make it fast. The night was dark, greatly impeding our labour. Still, though not a star or the moon could pierce the black masses of storm clouds that obscured the sky as they swept along before the gale, nature aided us in a measure. A soft light emanated from the movement of the ocean. Each mighty sea, all phosphorescent and glowing with the tiny lights of myriads of animalculae, threatened to overwhelm us with a deluge of fire. Higher and higher, thinner and thinner, the crest grew as it began to curve and overtop preparatory to breaking, until with a roar it fell over the bulwark, a mass of soft glowing light and tons of water which sent the sailors sprawling in all directions, and left in each nook and cranny little specks of light that glowed and trembled till the next sea washed them away, depositing new ones in their places. Sometimes several seas following each other with great rapidity and thundering down on our decks filled them full to the bulwarks, but soon they were discharged through the lee scuppers. To reef the mainsail we were forced to run off before the gale under the single reefed jib. By the time we had finished, the wind had forced up such tremendous sea that it was impossible to heave her to. Away we flew on the wings of the storm through the muck and flying spray. A wind sheer to starboard, then another to port, as the enormous seas struck the schooner astern and nearly broached her to. As day broke we took in the jib, leaving not a sail unfurled. Since we had begun scudding, she had ceased to take the seas over her bow, but amidships they broke fast and furious. It was a dry storm in the matter of rain, but the force of the wind filled the air with fine spray, which flew as high as the cross-tress, and cut the face like a knife, making it impossible to see over 100 yards ahead. The sea was a dark lead colour, as with long, slow, majestic roll it was heaped up by the wind into liquid mountains of foam. The wild antics of the schooner were sickening as she forged along. She would almost stop, as though climbing a mountain, then rapidly rolling to right and left as she gained the summit of a huge sea, she steadied herself and paused for a moment, as though affrighted at the yawning precipice before her. Like an avalanche she shot forward, and down as the sea astern struck her with the force of 1,000 battering rams, burying her bow to the catheads in the milky foam at the bottom that came on deck in all directions, forward, astern, to right and left, through the hawse pipes and over the rail. The wind began to drop, and by 10 o'clock we were talking of heaving her to. We passed a ship, 2 schooners, and a 4-masted barkentine under the smallest canvas, and at 11 o'clock, running up the spanker and jib, we hove her to, and in another hour we were beating back again against the after-sea, under full sail, to regain the sealing ground away to the westward. Below, a couple of men were sewing the bricklayer's body and canvas preparatory to the sea burial. And so with the storm passed away the bricklayer's soul. End of Typhoon of the Coast of Japan, Jack London's first story, published at the age of 17.